Number 1. The Americus and the Altair. On a single night in February of 1983, 2 crab boats left the harbor at Dutch Harbor, Alaska, and neither one came back. They were sister ships. Nearly identical hulls, each about 120 feet long, both part of the same Seattle-based fleet. If you had stood on the dock that evening, you would have seen 2 of the same boat side by side, loaded for the Bering Sea. By morning, 14 men were gone, and there was not a single survivor from either vessel. The first sign of disaster was the Americus herself. Another boat found her floating upside down, her keel turned up to the sky where her deck should have been. There was no radio call that explained what happened, no clear distress sequence, just an overturned hull and a growing silence where 2 crews used to be. To understand how this happens, you have to understand what these boats carry. A crab pod is a steel frame trap, often around 7 feet on a side, and each one can weigh 600 to 800 pounds. A working deck stacks these pots several high, tons of steel sitting well above the waterline. Every pound up high pulls at the boat's balance. Naval architects talk about the center of gravity and the righting arm, the built-in force that pulls a leaning boat back upright. Load, too much weight too high, and that force fades. The boat becomes tender. It leans, and it does not come back. Investigators believe the 2 vessels had been reconfigured before this trip. Their loading, their ballast, the way weight sat inside and on top of them, had changed from what the crews were used to. A boat that felt solid last season could sit dangerously different this one. The National Transportation Safety Board turned the case into a landmark study of vessel stability, one still taught today. And the Bering Sea gave no mercy. February brings air well below freezing, spray that turns to ice on contact, and short, steep waves that punish any weakness in balance. Whatever tipped the first boat likely tipped the second in the same conditions. That is the part that still unsettles fishermen. Not one boat, but 2 identical twins, lost the same night, in the same water, from the same fleet. The disaster helped push through the Commercial Fishing Industry Vessel Safety Act of 1988, which finally required survival suits, life rafts, and emergency drills. But that law came too late for these 14, and it raises the question that runs through every story here. How does a boat that floats perfectly one day roll over the next? Number 2, the St. Patrick. In late November of 1981, the crab boat St. Patrick was caught in a savage storm off Kodiak Island near Marmot Island in the Gulf of Alaska. The seas were enormous. The wind reached hurricane force. Through the night, the boat rolled hard, over and over, until the crew became convinced she was about to sink beneath them. So they made a decision that would haunt everyone who heard it. They abandoned the boat and went into the water. The water in that place, in that season, sits near freezing. To stay together in the dark, accounts say some of the crew tied themselves to one another before they went over the side. It seemed like the safest choice. Stay linked, stay close, wait for rescue, but the cold does not wait. Here is what near freezing water does to a body. In the first 1 to 3 minutes, there is cold shock. You gasp involuntarily. You cannot control your breathing. Many people drown in that first minute alone. If you survive the shock, your muscles begin to fail within about 10 minutes so that even a strong swimmer can no longer swim or grip, and then hypothermia sets in over the following half hour and beyond, dragging the body toward unconsciousness. Roped together on the surface, the crew of the St. Patrick began to die one by one through the long night. Most of those who went into the water did not survive. And in one of the cruelest twists in this entire history, a few crew members lived by doing the opposite of what the others chose. They stayed with the vessel. The boat that everyone feared would sink did not sink fast enough to kill them, and staying with it kept them out of the worst of the water. That is why this story is still told in safety courses and on the docks. It became a hard lesson in a single rule. Unless the vessel is truly going down beneath you, staying with the hull is almost always safer than committing your body to open, freezing water. A floating boat is easier for rescuers to see than a head in the waves, and it holds you up out of the cold. The St. Patrick happened before the 1988 safety law. Immersion suits, the thick neoprene survival suits that can extend a person's life in cold water for hours, were not standard gear then. Many crews simply did not have them. If they had, that night might have looked very different. The survivors carried the memory for the rest of their lives, because these disasters do not end when the rescue boat arrives. Number 3. the Katmai. In late October of 2008, the crab boat Katmai was fishing far out in the Aleutian Islands near a dock, one of the most remote inhabited places in the United States. A powerful storm rolled through, throwing up enormous seas, and the boat began to take on water. What followed was a long fight against the ocean coming in. There were 11 people aboard. By the end, 7 of them were dead. Only 4 came home. It stands as one of the deadliest single crab boat losses of the modern era. The crew fought the flooding as long as they could. Once water gets inside a vessel, a dangerous thing happens that engineers call the free surface effect. Loose water slides from side to side as the boat rolls, and that moving weight destroys stability far faster than the same weight sitting still. The more she flooded, the more unstable she became, and the harder she was to save. When there was no fight left, the crew pulled on their survival suits and went for the life raft in the dark. But abandoning ship in that place was its own ordeal. Adak sits at the far western edge of Alaska, hundreds of miles from major help. Aleutian storms in October routinely build seas of 20 to 30 feet and more, with gusts at hurricane strength. The United States Coast Guard launched a long-range helicopter rescue, flying to the edge of their range and their endurance to reach the survivors. Pulling people from storm seas at night so far from base is one of the hardest things a rescue crew can be asked to do. The survival suits mattered. They are the reason anyone lived. In water that cold, a person without protection has minutes. A person sealed inside a neoprene suit can last long enough for a helicopter to find them, if the helicopter can get there at all. The 7 who died were not beginners, they were experienced fishermen who knew these waters, and that is the quiet horror running underneath the Katmai. Experience does not cancel physics. A skilled crew on a sound boat can still lose if the flooding wins and the storm holds, and the nearest rescue is hundreds of miles behind them. The Katmai became a reference point for cold water survival and for what the Coast Guard can and cannot reach in time. And it points straight at the next kind of killer, the one that strikes not when a boat floods slowly, but when it is loaded past its limit before it ever leaves the dock. Number 4. The Big Valley. In the middle of January 2005, the Bering Sea Opilio season opened. Opilio is snow crab, and the opener is a frantic, high-stakes race. On that opening, the crab boat Big Valley rolled over in cold, rough water near the Pribilof Islands. Of the 6 men aboard, 5 died, 1 survived. He was found alive, floating in a survival suit, after hours in freezing water. The Big Valley was badly overloaded. Reports indicate she was carrying far more crab pots than her stability could safely support. Remember what a full pot weighs, 600 to 800 pounds of steel, and picture a deck stacked with too many of them. All that weight high up pulls the center of gravity toward the sky and leaves almost nothing in reserve when a wave leans the boat. In that condition, one hard roll can be the last. This was the era of derby fishing. Before the crab fishery was reorganized, seasons were short and openings were a sprint. Whoever caught the most in a narrow window won. That structure pushed crews to load every pot they could carry and to run in weather they should have avoided. The clock was the enemy, and safety lost the argument. The Coast Guard later described that stretch of the 2005 opener as one of the deadliest they had seen, with more than one vessel in distress. Icing made everything worse. When freezing spray coats a boat, it can add tons of extra weight in a short time, all of it high on the rails, the rigging, and the stacked pots. A boat already loaded to its edge has no room left for a coat of ice. When the Big Valley went over, she went fast. There was almost no time for an orderly abandoned ship. The single survivor lived for one reason. He was in his suit and afloat when help arrived. A few years later, the fishery moved to a quota system, often called crab rationalization. Instead of a race, each boat received a share it could catch on its own schedule. The goal was to kill the derby, and with it the pressure to overload and run in storms. Fishermen still argue about the trade-offs, but the safety logic was clear. Slow the race, and you stop forcing boats past their limit. The Big Valley is now taught beside a boat that vanished more than a decade later for the very same reason. Overloading plus cold water is not a one-time mistake. It is a pattern that keeps repeating, but not every death out here comes from a sinking boat. Some come from the deck itself. Number 5. The pot launch that pulls a man under. Not every horror in this fleet has a boat's name attached to it. The most common way a crab fisherman dies is quieter and in some ways more frightening because it can happen on a calm day. During a routine, the crew has done 10,000 times. Setting a crab pot means throwing that 600 to 800 pound steel trap over the side. Attached to it is a long coiled rope and a buoy. When the pot goes over the rail and starts to sink, the rope pays out after it, fast and violent, snaking across the deck as the weight drags it down. And here's the scenario every deckhand is trained to fear. A loop of that running line catches a boot, an ankle, a leg. The sinking pot becomes an anchor. In an instant, the crewman is yanked off his feet, dragged across the deck, and pulled over the rail into the sea, following 600 pounds of steel toward the bottom. Once that happens, there is almost no way out. The pot is heavier than any person, and it is going down. The only chance is to cut free in the split second before it is too late, which is why crews carry knives on deck for exactly this, to cut a shipmate loose from the line. There is a rule that comes straight out of these deaths: stay out of the bite. Never stand inside a loop of line. Because the loop is the trap. Being swept or pulled overboard is one of the leading causes of death in commercial fishing, right alongside the vessel disasters, and the water finishes what the line starts. In near-freezing seas, cold shock hits in the first minute, forcing an involuntary gasp that can drown even a powerful swimmer before he surfaces. A man overboard in Bering Sea conditions may have only minutes before he can no longer grip a rescue line or keep his head up. At night, in high seas, finding that head in the water is desperately hard. Then, add fatigue. During a hot opening, crews work shifts of 20 hours or more, day after day, until reactions dull and judgment slips. A tired hand is a fraction of a second slower, and a fraction of a second is the whole margin. Rogue and breaking waves add another way to vanish, sweeping an unsecured crewman clean off an open deck with no warning at all. That is what truly haunts these fishermen. Not only the great storms, but the knowledge that a single bad loop of rope on an ordinary set can take you under before anyone can move. Number 6. The Scandies Rose. On New Year's Eve, the 31st of December, 2019, the crab boat Scandies Rose was heading out for the season in the Gulf of Alaska, near Sutwick Island. It was dark and the conditions were brutal, with heavy freezing spray coating the vessel. Sometime that night, she capsized and sank. 7 crew were aboard. 5 of them died. 2 survived, pulled from a life raft in frigid water by the Coast Guard. The investigation that followed, led by the National Transportation Safety Board together with a Coast Guard Marine Board, pointed hard at one word: icing. When cold air meets sea spray on a boat that is already below freezing, the spray freezes on contact. Layer after layer, it coats the rails, the rigging, the stacked pots, and the superstructure. Every bit of that ice is weight, and most of it is high up and off to the sides, exactly where a boat can least afford it. Ice does the same thing a bad load of pots does. It raises the center of gravity and eats away the boat's ability to right itself. The boards examined the vessel's stability instructions, the guidance that tells a captain how much he can safely carry. A central question was whether that guidance truly accounted for how much ice a boat can pick up in real winter conditions. The findings suggested it may not have reflected a realistic worst case of icing for that weather. In other words, a captain could follow the paperwork and still end up in a boat the ocean could flip. Crews do fight the ice. In a storm, you will see fishermen out on a pitching deck with mallets and bats chipping ice off the rails by hand, hour after hour, exhausted just to keep the weight down. It is grueling, dangerous work, and against a serious freezing spray event, it can be a losing battle. When the Scandies Rose went over, it happened fast, with little time for a full evacuation. The survival suits and the life raft were the thin margin between the 2 who lived and the 5 who did not. The 2 survivors gave accounts of the sudden list and the scramble to get off, testimony that became central to the investigation. The sinking made headlines partly for its timing, the last night of the year, and partly because it proved something the industry needed to hear. Icing is not a problem from the old days. It is a present, modern killer. And it sets up a hard truth about how little warning some of these boats get. Number 7. The Ocean Challenger. Some boats fight the sea for hours. Others are simply gone in minutes. The Ocean Challenger, a crab vessel lost in Alaskan waters, is remembered for how fast she went down and how little time that left the crew to save themselves. When a boat sinks that quickly, it usually is not a slow settling by the bow. It is a sudden capsize or a sudden down flooding, water pouring in through an opening that should have been sealed. An open hatch, a door left undogged, a damaged closure. Any of these can let the sea in fast enough to sink a vessel in a matter of minutes. And when it happens that fast, the whole chain of survival actions collapses. There's no time to calmly pull on a survival suit, no time to launch a raft in an orderly way, no time to send a clear distress call and wait for help. That is what makes sudden onset disasters so deadly. Every safety system the fleet relies on assumes at least a little time. Time to react, time to signal, time to get to the gear. Take the time away, and even a well-equipped boat with a capable crew can be lost with almost no chance to respond. It is why watertight closures matter so much. Underway, in heavy weather, a boat's doors and hatches are the wall between floating and sinking. One that is left open or fails becomes a doorway for the ocean. And it is why emergency beacons, the automatic devices called EPIRBs, are so important. When a boat goes down too fast for a voice on the radio, an EPIRB can still float free and start signaling on its own, telling rescuers that something happened and roughly where. The cold water tells the rest of the story. Even a brief plunge into near-freezing seas without a suit is often fatal within minutes. When a boat sinks in seconds, the crew can end up in that water with none of the protection that keeps people alive and no time to reach it. The Ocean Challenger belongs to the grim toll of the middle 2000s, a period when disaster after disaster forced the industry to look hard at how these boats were run and regulated. Its lesson is blunt. Speed of onset is itself a killer. Sometimes the difference between life and death is not courage or skill. It is simply whether the ocean gives you any seconds at all. Number 8. The destination. In February of 2017, the Bering Sea crab boat destination was working near St. George Island out in the Pribilofs. And then she was gone. 6 men were aboard. All 6 were lost. There was no mayday, no distress call, nothing spoken over the radio. The first sign that anything had happened was the automatic signal from her emergency beacon. The National Transportation Safety Board investigated and built a picture from what was left. Their conclusion pointed to a familiar and deadly combination: heavy freezing spray, an overloaded boat, and reduced stability. The destination was carrying a heavy load of crab pots and bait while running in icing conditions. Hour by hour, as the spray froze onto her, the ice would have piled weight high on the boat and quietly stolen her stability, exactly the way it stole the Scandies Rose. The absence of any distress call is the chilling part. It tells investigators the end came fast. A crew has to have at least a moment to key a radio and speak. The destination's crew never got that moment. The most likely story is a rapid capsize, the boat rolling over so quickly that there was no time for a single word. Debris and an oil sheen on the surface marked the place where she went down. These were not inexperienced men. The captain and crew knew the Bering Sea. And once again, that is a lesson that refuses to soften. Knowing the water does not repeal the physics. When a boat is loaded to its edge and then coated in ice, it can cross the line from stable to capsized in moments, and no amount of experience aboard can argue with a center of gravity that has climbed too high. The destination and the Scandies Rose are now taught together, 2 modern icing disasters, only 2 years apart, both proof that this is not a danger from a rougher, older time. The board issued safety recommendations aimed squarely at the problem, calling for better stability guidance and sharper awareness of freezing spray so that a captain following the rules would actually be following rules that match the real ocean. February placed the destination in the heart of icing season, in some of the coldest and most exposed crab grounds anywhere. Its message is stark. Overloading plus icing can erase a boat and everyone on it in the time it takes to say the word. But the sea does not only kill in sudden violent moments. Number 9. Captain Phil Harris. If you have ever watched a show about Alaskan crab fishing, you probably know his face. Phil Harris was the captain of the crab boat Cornelia Marie and one of the most recognizable figures in the entire fishery, thanks to the television series that followed the fleet. He had spent decades running boats in the Bering Sea. And his death showed the world a side of the danger that has nothing to do with drowning. In January of 2010, after offloading crab at the docks in Dutch Harbor, Harris suffered a massive stroke. He was rushed off for medical care, but the damage was severe. He died on the 9th of February 2010 at the age of 53. His illness and his final days were captured by the show's cameras, which meant millions of people watched a crab captain's life end, not in a storm, but in a hospital, brought down from the inside. That is the part worth sitting with. The fishery's toll is not only the sudden violence of capsize in cold water, it is also the slow grind of the life itself. Long seasons of brutal hours, chronic sleep deprivation, constant physical strain, high stress, and the hard living that often goes with the job. All of it adds up year after year, and much of it lands on the heart. Harris's stroke was the kind of medical event that this lifestyle quietly makes more likely. There was a family dimension that made it hit even harder. His sons, Josh and Jake, were part of the crew and part of the story on screen. Audiences were not watching a stranger. They were watching a father, alongside his boys, doing a job that had defined his whole life. The remoteness played its role too. A stroke is an emergency measured in minutes, and Dutch Harbor is a long way from the kind of advanced medical care a big city takes. For granted, distance is its own danger out here, whether you are in the water or standing on a dock. Phil Harris turned a statistic into a person. Behind every fatality rate, behind every number that says this is one of the deadliest jobs on earth, there is a captain, a father, a crew who knew him. And once you start counting the people this fleet has lost, on the water and off it, the list is longer and stranger than any single storm can explain. Number 10. The curse that follows the fleet. Over the years, a striking number of people connected to the most famous crab fishing fleet have died on the water and off it. Enough that fans and the media began, half seriously, to talk about a curse. Consider the names. Captain Phil Harris of the Cornelia Marie died in 2010. After his stroke, Justin Tennyson, a deckhand featured on the show, died in 2011, still a young man. Tony Lara, a captain tied to the Cornelia Marie, died in 2015. Blake Painter, a former captain of the Maverick who appeared on the series, was found dead in 2018. And Nick Mavar, a longtime deckhand from the fleet, died in June of 2024 in Naknek, Alaska. Those are only some of them. Strung together like that, it can feel like something more than chance, as if the fleet were marked. But there is a clear rational reading underneath the folklore. A television series has spent nearly 2 decades following one of the most dangerous professions on the planet. Point a camera at a large group of people doing deadly work for that many years, and you will, tragically, record a great many deaths. The mechanisms are not one single thing. They span medical events, accidents, and the hazards of the fishing life both at sea and on land. The fishing lifestyle carries elevated risk in every direction, not just from the water. That is really the point of the whole list. The danger does not switch off when a season ends or when the cameras stop rolling. It follows these people home. Each name here is a real person, mourned by a real family and a tight crew that felt the loss. Because the show reached millions, those losses are grieved in public, which only deepens the sense that this fleet lives under a shadow. Call it a curse if you like. The framing is folklore, but the fatalities behind it are painfully real. And when you set them beside the sunken boats, the roped crew of the St. Patrick, the man dragged under by a pot, the twins lost the same night, the boats that vanished without a word, a single truth ties all of it together. The sea keeps a running tab on this fleet, and the fleet pays it year after year in the only currency the ocean accepts. That is what these fishermen carry with them every time they leave the harbor. Not a legend, a list of names. Step back from the individual stories, and nearly every death in this fleet traces to one of 3 killers. The first is capsize, when a boat rolls over and does not come back, driven by overloading, by icing, or by both together. The Americus and the Altair, the Big Valley, the Scandies Rose, and the Destination all died this way, their stability defeated by too much weight sitting too high. The second killer is going overboard, whether dragged over by a potline like the deckhands who never make the news, or swept off an open deck by a breaking wave. The third is the cold water itself, which finishes what the first 2 start. The St. Patrick's crew were killed by the water more than by the storm, roped together and freezing through the night. What is striking is how often 2 or 3 of these killers work together. A boat capsizes because it is overloaded and iced, which throws the crew into near-freezing water, where a cold shock and hypothermia do the rest. Rarely is it one clean cause. It is a chain, each link handing off to the next, and the safety systems the fleet has built exist to break that chain wherever they can. Stop the overload, and you may prevent the capsize. Prevent the capsize, and you keep the crew out of the water. Keep them out of the water, or seal them in a survival suit, and you buy the time a rescue needs. Understand the 3 killers, and every disaster in this video stops looking like bad luck, and starts looking like the same physics repeating. To see why these boats roll over, picture the forces holding one upright. Low in the hull sits weight that wants to keep the boat level, and there is a built-in restoring force, the righting arm, that pushes a leaning boat back toward upright. That force has limits. Pile weight high, with stacked steel pots or a thick coat of ice, and you raise the center of gravity toward the sky. The higher it climbs, the weaker the righting arm becomes, until a lean the boat once shrugged off becomes a lean it cannot recover from. That is a capsize. Flooding adds a second, faster danger, the free surface effect. Water loose inside a hull does not sit still. It slides toward the low side every time the boat rolls, piling weight exactly where it does the most harm and pulling the boat further over. A relatively small amount of loose water can undo a great deal of stability, which is why a flooding boat like the Katmai can turn unstable so quickly. Reserve buoyancy, the extra flotation a boat carries above its normal waterline, is what fights back. But overloading spends that reserve before the trip even begins. Put these together, and a clear picture emerges. A boat is not simply safe or unsafe. It is a balance that can be tipped by how it is loaded, how much ice it takes on, and how much water finds its way inside. A vessel that floats beautifully in the morning can become a boat the sea can flip by night, without a single thing about her hull having changed. Even when a crew survives the sinking, the water waits. The Bering Sea and the Gulf of Alaska in winter sit near freezing, often in the mid-30s Fahrenheit, and the human body fails there in stages. The first stage is cold shock in the opening 1 to 3 minutes. The cold triggers an involuntary gasp and rapid, uncontrollable breathing, and if your head is underwater during that gasp, you can drown almost instantly. That is why so many deaths happen in the first minute, before hypothermia is even a factor. If you survive the shock, the second stage arrives within about 10 minutes, as your hands, arms, and legs lose strength and coordination. This is swim failure. Even a strong swimmer can no longer swim, no longer grip a line, no longer pull himself up. Only after that, over 30 minutes and beyond, does true hypothermia take hold, cooling the core toward unconsciousness. This timeline is why 3 pieces of gear matter more than almost anything else. The immersion suit seals a person in insulating neoprene and can stretch survival from minutes into hours. The life raft lifts the body out of the water entirely, removing the cold's grip. And the emergency beacon, the EPIRB, calls for help automatically when there is no time to speak. Nearly every survivor in these stories owed their life to that chain, and the ones who died most often lacked a link in it. Against water this cold, the body's clock is merciless, and the only real defense is to cheat it with equipment. Read these disasters in order, and you are really reading the history of the rules that now govern the fleet. Before 1988, there were startling gaps. Boats could go to sea without required survival suits, without adequate life rafts, without mandatory emergency drills. St. Patrick and the Americus and Altair belonged to that era, and their losses helped force change. The Commercial Fishing Industry Vessel Safety Act of 1988 finally mandated much of the survival gear and training the fleet had been missing, the very equipment that later pulled single survivors alive from freezing water. Then came the problem of the race itself. In the Derby years, short openings pushed crews to overload and to run in dangerous weather. And the Big Valley is the monument to what that pressure cost. The move to a quota system in the mid-2000s, crab rationalization, was meant to end the sprint by giving each boat a share it could catch on its own time. And the newest chapter is being written now. The Destination and the Scandies. Rose exposed how stability guidance failed to account for real-world icing, and their investigations pushed for better standards and sharper freezing spray awareness. Each disaster, in other words, left a mark on the rulebook. The pattern is grim, but also hopeful. The fleet learns slowly and at terrible cost, and every rule now in place is there because a boat and a crew were lost teaching it. The regulations are, in a real sense, written in the names of the men who did not come home. So why do these particular stories stay with the people who fish, long after the reports are filed and the rules are rewritten? Part of it is the human layer no regulation can fully reach. The fatigue of 20-hour shifts that dulls a hand at the worst possible second. The old pressure of the race that put money and the clock ahead of caution. The simple distance of these grounds, where the nearest rescue can be hundreds of miles and hours away, and where sometimes there are no seconds to give. But mostly it is the names. 14 men lost on 2 identical boats the same night. A crew roped together, dying one by one in the dark. A lone survivor pulled from the water while 5 shipmates did not come up. A captain brought down by a stroke with his sons aboard. A boat that vanished without a single word on the radio. Fishermen carry these stories not as legends but as warnings, and as company, every time they cross the bar and head out into the same water that took them. The ocean out here is not cruel. It is only indifferent, and it obeys a physics that does not bend for skill or courage or need. That is the hardest truth this fleet lives with. The sea keeps a running tab, and it collects year after year, whether or not anyone is watching. What the fishermen bring home, when they are lucky enough to come home, is a full hold and a quiet, permanent list of the ones who did not. And that is why it still haunts them. The list never really closes.